The sound of a gavel is the sound of finality. For Judge Arthur Sterling, it was the sound of another victory, another rung climbed on the ladder of power. For 17-year-old Maya Washington, a quiet girl who spoke more through her sketchbook than her words, it was the sound of her life ending. Sentenced to life in a maximum security prison for a murder she didn't commit, she was just another case file closed, another statistic in a broken system. But Judge Sterling, in his gleaming robes and unshakable arrogance, had no idea that one person in that courtroom was about to make a single phone call. A call that would not just challenge the verdict, but detonate the entire corrupt system he commanded. The air in courtroom 4B of the Oak Haven County Courthouse was thick with the ghosts of past judgments. It smelled of old paper, cheap floor polish, and the faint metallic tang of human anxiety. Sunlight, heavy with dust motes, streamed through the tall arched windows, illuminating the scene like a Renaissance painting of suffering and authority. At the center of it all, perched high on his judicial throne, was the Honorable Judge Arthur Sterling. To the casual observer, Judge Sterling was the very picture of justice. His hair was a distinguished silver, his jawline was firm, and his black robes fell around him with a weight that suggested not just fabric, but moral gravity. He held the gavel in his hand, its polished wood cool and familiar. He had built his entire career on moments like this. He was known as Sterling Justice, a moniker the local press had affectionately given him. He was tough, decisive, and had a conviction rate that was the envy of every prosecutor in the state, and a point of interest for the governor, who had a Supreme Court seat to fill next year. Before him stood 17-year-old Maya Washington. She wasn't standing so much as being held up by the sheer force of will of her public defender, a tired, overworked man named David Chen, who already looked defeated. Maya was a slip of a girl with wide, expressive eyes that were now hollowed out by fear and confusion. Her hands cuffed in front of her were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. These were the same hands that just 3 months ago were smudging charcoal across a sketch pad, creating worlds of fantasy and beauty. Now they were bound in steel. The crime was brutal and high profile. Ethan Davenport, the 19-year-old son of real estate magnate Robert Davenport, had been found murdered in a city park. Ethan was Oak Haven's golden boy, charming, athletic, and heir to a fortune that had practically built the city. The pressure to find his killer had been immense. The police, led by the ambitious detective Frank Miller, had zeroed in on Maya with unnerving speed. Their case was a tapestry woven from thin threads. Maya, a scholarship kid at the elite Oak Haven Prep, where Ethan also attended, was a loner. She was quiet. She was black. She was poor. In the world of the Davenports that made her an outsider and thus a suspect, they claimed she had been obsessed with Ethan, that he had rejected her, and she had flown into a vengeful rage. The evidence was a single vague entry in her diary about wanting to escape her life, and a partial footprint found near the scene that could be consistent with her brand of sneakers. There was no murder weapon, no DNA, no confession, just a narrative. Judge Sterling had listened to it all. He had watched the prosecutor, a sharp-suited shark named Lawrence Keene, paint Maya as a cunning, jealous monster. He had watched David Chen's fumbling attempts to poke holes in a case that was more narrative than fact, and he had made his decision long before the jury foreman, a man whose plumbing business had 3 lucrative contracts with Davenport Construction, read the guilty verdict. Maya Washington. Judge Sterling's voice boomed, silencing the rustling and weeping from the public gallery where Maya's grandmother sat, her body trembling. Please rise. Maya flinched, her legs barely cooperating. Sterling looked down at her, not seeing a child, but a problem to be solved, a box to be checked on his path to greater things. Robert Davenport, the victim's father, had made his expectations clear in a private meeting in the judge's chambers just last week, a meeting that never appeared on any official schedule. This city needs to see that justice is absolute, Arthur. Davenport had said, his voice smooth but laced with steel. No leniency, no weakness. The unspoken promise of a hefty donation to Sterling's future political campaigns hung in the air. You have been found guilty of the charge of murder in the 1st degree. Sterling intoned, his face an impassive mask. This court has heard the evidence. It has seen the callousness of the act, the remorseless nature of the defendant. Maya's mouth opened, a silent plea forming, but no sound came out. Remorseless, she was drowning in a sea of sorrow for Ethan, whom she had considered a quiet friend, and for herself for the life being stolen from her. She had tried to tell them. She had tried to explain that Ethan used to meet her in the park sometimes to escape his own pressures, that they would sit in silence and just draw. He had admired her art. He had been kind. But her words were twisted, her sketchbook presented as a stalker's log. This city will not tolerate such violence. Sterling continued, his voice rising with theatrical fervor. It will not stand by while the lives of its promising young citizens are extinguished by envy and rage. He was speaking to the news cameras at the back of the room, to the governor, to Robert Davenport, who sat in the front row, a perfect portrait of grieving power. Therefore, it is the sentence of this court. Judge Sterling paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. That you, Maya Washington, shall be committed to the custody of the Department of Corrections for the remainder of your natural life, without the possibility of parole. A gut-wrenching scream tore from Maya's grandmother. Maya herself just crumpled her legs, giving way completely. The sound of the gavel striking the block was like a gunshot in the silent courtroom. Crack. Final. As the bailiffs hauled Maya to her feet and began to lead her away, her eyes wide and pleading found Judge Sterling's. For a fleeting second, the judge felt a flicker of something, a tiny, uncomfortable prickle in his conscience. He saw not a monster, but a terrified child. He quickly extinguished it. Weakness was a luxury he could not afford. He straightened his robes, gave a solemn nod to the press, and retreated to his chambers, already thinking about the congratulatory call he would receive from Davenport. He had no idea that in the third row of the jury box, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Jenkins was clutching her purse, her knuckles as white as Maya's, her heart pounding with a guilt that was about to change everything. Sarah Jenkins was not a hero. She sold artisanal soaps at the weekend farmer's market. Her life was a quiet routine of mixing lye water and essential oils. It was predictable. It was safe. The jury summons had been an unwelcome disruption, and the Davenport murder trial had been a nightmare. From day one, she had felt a deep, gnawing unease. The prosecutor, Lawrence Keene, was slick and persuasive, but his arguments felt hollow. He presented Maya Washington's shyness as arrogance, her poverty as motive, and her race as an unspoken footnote of otherness. Sarah had looked at Maya and seen not a killer, but the shy girl who used to sit in the corner of the coffee shop where Sarah graded her students' papers back when she was a part-time English tutor. She'd seen a kid. During deliberations, the atmosphere in the jury room had been toxic. The foreman, a burly man named Carl, had steered the conversation with an iron fist. "Come on, it's open and shut," he'd boomed. "The Davenports are good people. This girl was a leech obsessed. What more do you need?" When Sarah had tried to raise her doubts, the lack of physical evidence, the flimsy motive, she was shouted down. Another juror, a man who worked for a subsidiary of Davenport Construction, had sneered, "You want to let a cop killer's daughter go free?" That wasn't true. Maya's father was a decorated veteran who died in service, but the lie had been planted somewhere and it stuck. They were belittled, pressured. Carl reminded them how long they'd be sequestered. If they couldn't reach a unanimous decision, how they'd be letting the whole city down. It was a methodical, psychological dismantling of dissent. In the end, exhausted and intimidated, Sarah had caved. She had whispered the word guilty, and a piece of her soul had shriveled. Now, 3 days after the sentencing, the guilt was a physical presence. It sat on her chest when she tried to sleep. The scent of lavender and chamomile in her workshop, usually a comfort, now seemed cloying and suffocating. Judge Sterling's sanctimonious words and the sound of Maya's grandmother's scream echoed in her mind. She had seen the injustice up close. She had been a cog in its machine, and she couldn't live with it. On a Tuesday morning after another sleepless night, she made a decision. Her hands trembled as she sat at her kitchen table, a yellow legal pad in front of her. She'd spent hours online searching for wrongful convictions, legal aid for inmates, appeals lawyers. The names were a blur of corporate law firms and nonprofits with year-long waiting lists. Then she found a name buried in an old news article about a prosecutor who had left the DA's office to become a defense attorney after a case he'd won was overturned on DNA evidence. His name was Benjamin Carter. The article painted him as a man haunted by the system he once served. The website for Carter Law PLLC was simple, almost stark. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise miracles. It just had a phone number. Sarah stared at the number for a full 10 minutes. This was insane. What could she even say? Hi, I was on the jury and I think we got it wrong. They'd laugh at her. Or worse, she could get in trouble. Jury deliberations were sacred secret. But then she pictured Maya's face, the light in her eyes extinguished by that gavel. Her hand still shaking picked up her phone. She dialed. It rang 3 times, each ring a hammer blow against her ribs. Carter Law, a brisk professional voice answered. A paralegal, probably. Hello, Sarah stammered, her voice a dry croak. I need to speak with Mr. Benjamin Carter. Regarding, the voice was polite but firm. It's a personal matter, a legal matter. It's very important. I can take a message. Mr. Carter is preparing for court. No, Sarah said with more force than she intended. Please, you don't understand. A girl was just sentenced to life in prison, and it was wrong. There was a pause on the other end. Sarah could hear the clacking of a keyboard. Are you a relative? No, I was on the jury. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The paralegal was likely trained for all sorts of calls, but this was not one of them. Hold, please. Sarah held her breath. She heard muffled voices, and then a new voice, deeper and laced with weary skepticism, came on the line. This is Ben Carter. Who is this? My name is Sarah Jenkins, she said, her voice small. I was a juror on the State versus Maya Washington case. Ben Carter sighed. The sound was audible, a gust of pure cynicism. He remembered the case from the news, a slam dunk for the prosecution, an open and shut tragedy. Jurors' remorse was common. Ms. Jenkins' deliberations are confidential. I'm sure it was a difficult experience, but the verdict has been rendered. There's nothing you or I can do about it now. He was already mentally dismissing her, turning his attention back to the brief on his desk. No, you don't understand, Sarah pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a real deliberation. We were pressured. The foreman, Carl Weatherby, he works for a Davenport company. Another juror, too. They wouldn't let us discuss the evidence. They just bullied us. The words tumbled out, a frantic, desperate confession. There was no evidence, no real evidence. They just wanted someone to pay, and she was easy. She was a poor black kid, and the victim was rich and white. Please, Mr. Carter, I know what I saw. The Judge Sterling, he looked right through her. He knew. Ben Carter froze. The mention of the foreman's connection to Davenport was not just jurors' remorse. That was a potential bombshell. Jury tampering, conflict of interest. It was the kind of procedural rot that, if proven, could overturn a verdict. Still, it was a long shot. People made these claims all the time. Ms. Jenkins, do you have any proof of this? Proof? Carl was bragging about his contracts with Davenport before we were even sequestered. I didn't think anything of it then. Another juror, a man named Henderson, he works for Davenport Logistics. It's all public record. Please just look into it. Just look at the trial transcripts. Look at the lack of evidence. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I helped send a child to die in a cage. Her voice broke on the last word, dissolving into a sob. It was the raw, unvarnished agony in her voice that finally pierced through Ben Carter's armor of cynicism. He had spent 5 years as a prosecutor, believing in the system, and the last 10 as a defense attorney, knowing it was broken. He had seen its casual cruelty, its preference for easy narratives over messy truths. He had his own ghosts, his own wrongful conviction that kept him up at night. He recognized the sound of a conscience cracking under a weight it could no longer bear. It was a sound he knew intimately. He leaned forward in his chair, the brief on his desk forgotten. The city, the system, the powerful Davenport family, it would be a war against a giant. A war he would almost certainly lose, but Sarah Jenkins' trembling voice had just handed him a single smooth stone. Ms. Jenkins, he said, his own voice now quiet and serious. Sarah, don't talk to anyone else about this. Not a soul. Can you come to my office 1 hour? The cinder block penitentiary for women was a place where hope went to be ground into dust. It was a sprawling concrete scar on an otherwise barren landscape, surrounded by layers of razor wire that glinted menacingly under the harsh sun. The air inside smelled of bleach and despair. Ben Carter hated prisons. They were monuments to his profession's failures. As he was led through a series of clanging steel doors, the sounds echoed his own jaded heartbeat. He was here to see Maya Washington, client intake form 734, inmate 9527. After his call with Sarah Jenkins, he had done exactly as she asked. He had spent 2 days buried in the transcripts and case files of State versus Washington. What he found was appalling. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in narrative construction built on innuendo and class prejudice. The evidence was so circumstantial it was practically transparent. Maya's public defender had been hopelessly outmatched, failing to object to leading questions and inflammatory statements. The whole thing stank. He found the public records for the jury. Sarah was right. Carl Weatherby's plumbing company had received 2 major contracts from Davenport Construction just a month before the trial. George Henderson was a mid-level manager at a Davenport-owned logistics firm. It was more than a conflict of interest. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of the trial's legitimacy. Now he had to meet the girl at the center of it all. The guards led him to a small, sterile room, divided by a thick pane of plexiglass. A moment later, Maya was brought in. She wore a drab gray jumpsuit that hung loosely on her thin frame. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes, those same wide eyes from the courtroom, seemed to have retreated into her face, vacant and dull. She looked a decade older than 17. She sat down without a word, her cuffed hands resting on the small counter. "Maya," Ben began gently, "my name is Benjamin Carter. I'm a lawyer." She didn't react. She just stared at the table. "I'm not your public defender," he continued. "I'm a private attorney. I've reviewed your case. I believe there were serious problems with your trial." Still nothing. The girl was encased in a shell of trauma so thick he wasn't sure his words could penetrate it. "Maya, I'm here to help you," he said, leaning closer to the glass. "But I need you to talk to me. Tell me what happened." Finally, she lifted her head. Her gaze was empty. "Does it matter?" she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "They decide what happened. They write the story. I'm just in it." Her words hit Ben with the force of a physical blow. In her simple, devastating sentence, she had summarized the entirety of the broken system. "I want to help you write a different story," Ben said, his voice firm. "The true one. But you have to trust me. Start from the beginning. Tell me about Ethan." For a long time she was silent. Ben waited. He didn't push. He just sat there, a quiet presence on the other side of the glass. Finally she began to speak. Her story was not one of obsession, but of a quiet, shared loneliness. Ethan, suffocated by his father's expectations, found a kindred spirit in the girl who could sit for an hour without needing to fill the silence with noise. They would meet in the park not for a secret romance, but for a shared moment of peace. "He liked my drawings," Maya said, a flicker of life returning to her eyes. He said I could see things other people didn't. His father hated that he liked art. He wanted him to be a shark like him. Ethan just wanted to be." She told him about the day of the murder. They had planned to meet, but he never showed up. She waited for an hour, then went home worried. The next day, the police were at her door. "Did Ethan ever mention being afraid of anyone?" Ben asked. "Did he have any enemies?" Maya shook her head. "He was afraid of his father. Not like physically afraid. He was afraid of disappointing him. His father, Mr. Davenport, he was always angry. Ethan told me his father found his sketchbook once and tore it to pieces. Said it was a waste of a man's time." An idea, cold and sharp, began to form in the back of Ben's mind. "Maya, your public defender, did he give you your things back from the trial?" She nodded. "My grandma has them. A box." "Is your sketchbook in there?" "The one the prosecution used." "Yes, they only showed the jury 1 page." "I need to see it," Ben said. "All of it." The visit ended a few minutes later. As Ben walked out of the prison, the heavy doors clanging shut behind him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just fighting a procedural error. He was fighting for a person. He drove straight to the modest, rundown apartment where Maya's grandmother, a stoic and heartbroken woman named Rose Washington, was living. She greeted him with weary suspicion, but when Ben explained that he believed in Maya's innocence, her composure cracked. She handed him the cardboard box of Maya's belongings. On top was the sketchbook. It was a standard, spiral-bound artist's pad. Ben sat at the small kitchen table and opened it. The first few pages were filled with the drawings the world knew portraits of Ethan, sketches of the park. But as Ben turned the pages, he saw what the jury hadn't. Maya hadn't just drawn Ethan. She had drawn everything. Intricate drawings of birds, architectural sketches of the school library, portraits of her grandmother, fantastical creatures from her imagination. It wasn't a log of obsession. It was the visual diary of a gifted, observant artist. Then he reached the last few pages. These were different. They weren't from Maya's usual charcoal pencils. They were rough, angry-looking sketches in a heavy masculine hand. Stick figures, angry scribbles, and words. One page had a drawing of a large, imposing man with dollar signs for eyes standing over a smaller figure. Written above it were the words, "My father the king." Ben turned the page. There in the same aggressive handwriting was a series of numbers and letters. It looked like a code. GLDRT 4589 transfer. Below it a date from 2 days before the murder. It wasn't Maya's handwriting, it was Ethan's. Ben's blood ran cold. Maya had said Ethan liked to draw with her sometimes. He had used her sketchbook. What the hell was this? It looked like a transaction number. A bank routing code. He pulled out his phone and took a photo of the page. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The key to freeing Maya Washington wasn't just in the jury room misconduct. It was right here, hidden in plain sight in the pages of a quiet girl's sketchbook. And it pointed somewhere far darker and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Ben Carter felt like he was staring at a Rosetta Stone of corruption. The scribbled code from Ethan's hand in Maya's sketchbook, GLDRT 4589 transfer, was a meaningless jumble of characters to the naked eye. But to Ben it felt like a key. His prosecutorial instincts, long dormant, roared back to life. This wasn't just a scribble. This was a clue left behind by a dead boy. He needed someone who could navigate the labyrinthine world of offshore accounts and shell corporations, someone who understood how the ultra-rich made money disappear. He knew exactly who to call. His name was Michael "Mickey" Finn. Mickey was a forensic accountant, a man who had spent 30 years of his life either helping corporations hide money for the IRS or finding it for the Department of Justice. He was a bloodhound with a calculator, and he owed Ben a favor from an old case. Ben met Mickey in a noisy Irish pub downtown, the kind of place where conversations could be easily swallowed by the ambient cheer. He slid a photo of the sketchbook page across the sticky table. "What do you make of this Mickey?" A short, balding man with spectacles perched on his nose squinted at the phone. "Looks like my kid's math homework." "What is it?" "It's from the sketchbook of the kid who just got sent down for the Davenport murder." Ben said quietly, "But it's not her handwriting. I think it's Ethan Davenport's." Mickey's interest was piqued. He took the phone, zoomed in. GLD could be a ticker symbol, could be an acronym. RT, routing transit, transfer is obvious. The numbers could be anything. An account number, a transaction ID. He pursed his lips. "You think the kid stumbled onto something?" "I think his father is Robert Davenport," Ben said, letting the name hang in the air. "And powerful men often have powerful secrets." Mickey nodded slowly, a grin spreading across his face. He loved a good puzzle, especially one that involved taking down a titan. "All right, Carter, I'll sniff around. But this kind of deep dive, it's not fast and it's not cheap. Find something solid and I'll find the money," Ben promised. While Mickey dug into the financial labyrinth, Ben focused on the human element. He went back to Sarah Jenkins. He needed more than her testimony. He needed her to be his inside source on the jury. Over coffee at a discreet diner miles from Oakhaven, he had her walk him through the deliberations, minute by excruciating minute. "Carl Weatherby, the foreman," she recounted, her voice low. "He kept saying things like, 'A quick verdict is a good verdict. It shows the city were decisive.' Honey." He mentioned his business, how busy he was, how the Davenport contracts were a godsend for his guys. "Did he ever mention Judge Sterling?" Ben asked. Sarah paused, thinking. "Once, someone asked if we could request to see more evidence, the whole sketchbook maybe." Carl laughed and said, Judge Sterling runs a tight ship. He's not going to entertain a fishing expedition. He's given us what we need to convict. It felt like he was quoting someone. He runs a tight ship. The phrase echoed what Robert Davenport had said to Sterling in his chambers. It was a talking point. This wasn't just a rogue jury foreman. This was a coordinated effort. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, all marching to the same beat, played by the same drummer, Robert Davenport. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. Ben's paralegal, a sharp young woman named Clara, was tasked with digging into Judge Sterling himself. She spent a week sifting through property records, campaign finance disclosures, and public filings. Most of it was clean, meticulously so. Sterling was a careful man, but Clara found the thread. "Ben, look at this," she said, dropping a file on his desk. Judge Sterling's wife, Catherine Sterling. 3 years ago, she started a boutique art consultancy firm. It has almost no public profile, but it has one major client. Ben leaned forward. "Let me guess. A holding company called Oak Haven Future Fund," Clara said. "Guess who the sole proprietor of that fund is? Robert Davenport." "Bingo," Clara confirmed. "Over the past 2 years, the fund has paid Mrs. Sterling's firm $750,000 in consulting fees. For what I have no idea, the firm has no other clients and no listed projects." Ben felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the motive. It wasn't just political ambition. It was cold hard cash. Judge Sterling wasn't just influenced by Davenport. He was owned by him. The trial was a sham, a piece of theater paid for, with laundered money passed through the judge's wife. A week later, Mickey called. His voice was electric. "Ben, you're not going to believe this," he said, forgoing any greeting. The scribble in the book, it wasn't a bank code. It was an internal project code for Davenport Construction. A project code? Ben was confused. For a building. "Not a building," Mickey said, his voice dropping. "A payoff. GLD isn't a stock. It's Gateway Land Development. It's a massive city redevelopment project that's been stalled in zoning for 5 years. The head of the zoning commission is a city councilman named Albert Rossi." Ben felt his world tilting. The Gateway project was a huge deal worth billions. "Go on," Ben urged. "Davenport needed Rossi's vote to push the project through," Mickey explained. "Rossi is famously clean, but he has one weakness, a degenerate gambling habit. He was deep in the hole with some very unpleasant people. Davenport didn't pay him directly. He used a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, Red Turtle Holdings. RT, Ben's mind raced. GLD, RT Gateway Land Development. Red Turtle. The number, Ben breathed. 4589. It's the last 4 digits of the offshore account number where the money was sent. Mickey confirmed. $5 million. The transfer happened 2 days before Ethan was killed. I found the wire confirmation buried 6 layers deep in their subsidiary accounting. The kid wasn't just doodling, he was taking notes. He must have found his father's ledger, or overheard something. He found proof that his father, the great civic leader, bribed a public official to the tune of $5 million. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Ethan wasn't killed by a jealous, underprivileged classmate. He was killed because he had become a threat to his father's empire. The quiet kid who liked to draw had stumbled upon the rot at the core of his family's fortune, and he had been silenced. And Robert Davenport hadn't just covered up his son's murder. He had framed an innocent girl for it, using his pet judge and a stacked jury to ensure she would be buried so deep in the system she would never see the light of day again. Ben Carter leaned back in his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear. The case was no longer just about freeing Maya Washington. It was about tearing down the entire corrupt dynasty that had put her in that cage. He had the threat of greed. Now he just had to pull it and watch the whole damn tapestry unravel. Armed with Mickey Finn's financial bombshell and Clara's discovery of the payments to Judge Sterling's wife, Ben Carter, knew he couldn't fight this war in a courtroom. Oak Haven's legal system was a fortress, and Robert Davenport and Judge Sterling were its kings. A standard appeal would be slow-walked, stone-walled, and ultimately crushed. He had to go around the fortress and blow a hole in the wall from the outside. He needed 2 things: federal jurisdiction and public outrage. His first call was not to a judge, but to a name from his past at the Department of Justice, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Flores. Flores was a bulldog who had a reputation for taking on public corruption cases that no one else would touch. She and Ben had clashed in the past, but they shared a mutual respect for the law, if not for each other's methods. They met in a sterile federal building conference room that felt a world away from the compromised grandeur of Oak Haven County Courthouse. Ben laid it all out: the compromised jury, the payments to the judge's wife, the offshore accounts, the Gateway land development bribe, and the explosive theory that Ethan Davenport was murdered to cover it all up. He concluded by sliding the photo of the sketchbook page across the table. Flores listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Ben finished, she stared at the photo for a long moment. "Carter, this is a hell of a conspiracy theory," she said, her tone skeptical. "You're accusing one of the most powerful men in the state of murdering his own son, and a sitting judge of being his accomplice." "I am," Ben said calmly, "and I'm telling you the proof of the financial crimes is locked in Davenport's ledgers, and the proof of the frame-up is in the court's own records. You have the power to subpoena what I can't. Get the original financial records from Red Turtle Holdings. Get Judge Sterling's personal bank statements. Get the phone records between him and Davenport in the week leading up to the sentencing." Flores tapped a pen on the table. "This is thin, Ben. The bribe is one thing, but connecting it to the murder, that's a huge leap." "Is it?" Ben countered. "A 17-year-old girl with no history of violence and no physical evidence tying her to the scene is sentenced to life by a judge who's on the killer's payroll. That's not a leap, Maria. That's the whole goddamn picture." He saw a flicker in her eyes. The bulldog had caught the scent. "I'll look into the financial angle," she conceded. "Wire fraud, bribery, that's federal. If I can get a warrant on that, we'll see what else we shake loose. But you need to keep this quiet. If Davenport gets spooked, that evidence will be ashes before my warrant is signed." The second part of Ben's plan was riskier. He met with Amelia Vance, an investigative journalist for a national newspaper known for her relentless, long-form exposés. Ben had used her once before to break a story and trusted her discretion. In a hushed corner of a hotel lobby, he gave her the sanitized version of the story, not the explosive murder theory, but the verifiable corruption. A sitting judge's wife receiving $750,000 from the father of a victim in a trial her husband is presiding over. Ben said, "A jury foreman whose business is booming thanks to contracts from that same victim's father. An innocent girl sentenced to life based on nothing. That's your story. You can verify every bit of it without tipping our hand on the bigger picture." Amelia's eyes lit up. "When can I run it?" "You can't, not yet," Ben instructed. "You get it ready. Write the whole damn thing. Get your editors on board. But you hold it until I give you the signal. The moment Flores moves with a warrant, you publish. We hit them from the legal and public angles at the exact same time. A shock and awe campaign." For the next 2 weeks, the city of Oak Haven went on as normal, oblivious to the storm gathering just over the horizon. Judge Sterling presided over his cases with his usual stern authority. Robert Davenport attended charity galas, the picture of a stoic father mourning his son. Then on a Wednesday morning, the first crack appeared. A team of FBI agents led by Maria Flores executed a search warrant at the headquarters of Davenport Construction. They weren't there for a murder investigation. They were there as part of a federal probe into wire fraud and bribery related to the Gateway land development project. The move sent a shockwave through the city's financial and political elite. The moment Ben got the call from Flores' office confirming the raid was underway, he called Amelia Vance. "Now," he said. 2 hours later, her story dropped. The headline was a cannonball: "Justice for sale in Oak Haven. Judge's family paid by victim's father in life sentence murder trial." The article was a meticulous, brutal takedown. It laid out the payments to Catherine Sterling's consulting firm, the jury foreman's conflict of interest, and the flimsy nature of the case against Maya Washington. It didn't accuse anyone of murder, but it didn't have to. The implication was clear and devastating. The system was rigged. The city erupted. The story went viral, picked up by every national news outlet. Protesters began to gather outside the courthouse, holding signs with Maya's face on them. The governor's office, which had been grooming Sterling for the Supreme Court, issued a panicked statement promising a full inquiry. City Councilman Albert Rossi, seeing his name connected to the Gateway project, promptly had what his office described as a stress-related health emergency and was unreachable. Inside Davenport Tower, Robert Davenport was in a rage. He saw his perfectly constructed world crumbling. He had underestimated the system's potential for self-preservation. When the FBI came knocking, people talked. The real break came from inside the fortress. Detective Frank Miller, the ambitious cop who had built the case against Maya, saw the writing on the wall. He knew his career was over if he went down with Davenport and Sterling. He had been complicit, pushing the weak case forward under immense pressure from the judge and the DA. He decided to save himself. He walked into Maria Flores's office with his lawyer and cut a deal. The case against the girl was garbage, and we all knew it. He confessed his statement recorded on video. Judge Sterling called me directly. He told me to focus on Washington. He said, "Mr. Davenport is confident she's the one." He killed our other leads. There was another person of interest we never followed up on. Who? Flores demanded. A disgruntled former employee of Davenport's, Miller said. A security guard named Kevin Fuller. Davenport fired him personally about a month before the murder. Fuller had threatened him, said he knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. We were going to bring him in for questioning, but the order came down from Sterling's office via the DA to focus exclusively on Maya Washington. We were told to drop the Fuller lead. It was the final piece. The FBI located Kevin Fuller working a dead-end security job 2 states away. Fearing he was about to be pinned for a murder he didn't commit, Fuller sang like a canary. He told them that Ethan hadn't been a saint. The boy had a conscience. He had found evidence of his father's crimes, specifically the Rossi bribe, and had confronted him. Fuller had overheard the shouting match. Ethan was going to go to the DA, Fuller stated. Robert told him he was being a naive fool, that he would ruin the family. Ethan said he didn't care, that he couldn't live like that. That was the motive Flores needed. It wasn't just that Ethan knew. It was that he was about to talk. Armed with Miller's confession and Fuller's testimony, Maria Flores got her second warrant. This one wasn't for financial records. It was for the arrest of Robert Davenport on suspicion of the murder of his son, and for the arrest of Judge Arthur Sterling on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accepting a bribe. The dam had broken. The system wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing into a flood of its own corruption. The downfall was not a slow decay, it was a seismic collapse. The arrests of Judge Arthur Sterling and Robert Davenport sent a tectonic shockwave through Oak Haven, toppling foundations of power that had been considered unshakable for a generation. The first to fall was the judge. Federal agents arrived at Sterling's palatial home in the exclusive suburb of Chestnut Hill, just as the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. There was no battering ram, no shouting, just a firm, insistent rap on the heavy oak door. Sterling himself answered, dressed in a silk robe, his face a mask of sleepy indignation that quickly curdled into disbelief as he saw the badges and the unsmiling face of Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Flores on his doorstep. The reporters Amelia Vance had tipped off were kept at a distance, but their long-lens cameras captured everything: the judge's face turning from crimson rage to a pasty ashen gray, his wife Catherine's shriek from an upstairs window, the clinical, almost gentle way the agents cuffed his hands in front of him. As they let him out, the man who had built a career on projecting an image of ironclad authority looked startlingly small and frail, a ghost haunted by the sudden arrival of his own sins. The clicking of the cameras was the new gavel, passing a sentence of public humiliation, long before he would see a courtroom. Robert Davenport's reckoning came a few hours later. He was not taken by surprise in his home. He was in his throne room, a penthouse office atop Davenport Tower, a glass and steel monument to his own ego. The call came from his high-priced lawyer, his voice strained. "Robert, they're here. Flores's office. It's not a negotiation." There was a long silence. From his window, Davenport could see the entire city spread out below him, a kingdom he had built and controlled. He was a man who moved markets, bought politicians, and erased problems. But he could not erase his dead son, and he could not erase the determined federal prosecutor at his door. His surrender was a calculated piece of theater. He descended in his private elevator, strode through the marble lobby flanked by lawyers, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. He didn't look like a man being arrested. He looked like a king being momentarily inconvenienced, an image he fought to maintain until the very end. The legal system of Oakhaven, poisoned from the top, went into anaphylactic shock. District Attorney Lawrence Keene, facing federal investigation and public revulsion, held a tearful press conference and announced his immediate resignation. His career ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic whimper. Detective Frank Miller, seeing his choice as prison or the witness stand, became the government's most valuable asset, his detailed testimony providing a damning, step-by-step chronicle of the conspiracy. Amidst the chaos, Ben Carter filed a single powerful motion petition to vacate judgment and expunge all records for Maya Washington. The hearing was a formality, but also a profound moment of catharsis. It was held in a different courtroom before a different judge, a stern older woman who looked down at Maya not as a file number, but as a human being. Ben Carter's argument was short and blistering. For months, he said, his voice ringing with quiet fury. This chamber, this symbol of justice, was used as a tool of a conspiracy. It was used to hide a murder, to protect a powerful man, and to sacrifice an innocent child. Today is the day this institution begins to heal itself. The judge agreed. In a voice filled with contempt for her disgraced colleague, she declared Maya's conviction null and void, ordering it not just overturned, but expunged. It is the finding of this court, she declared, looking directly at Maya, that you were the victim of a crime, not the perpetrator of one. You are and always have been innocent. You are free. Maya's release from the cinder block penitentiary was a quiet, sacred moment. The last steel door slid open with a deafening groan, revealing a gray, overcast sky. She blinked the open space, feeling vast and terrifying after months in confinement. The air itself felt different, thick with the scent of rain and exhaust fumes, the smell of life. And then she saw them. Her grandmother rose, her face a torrent of tears and smiles, and Ben Carter standing beside her, his usual weary expression replaced by one of profound relief. Maya didn't run. She walked step by tentative step, as if testing the solidity of the ground before collapsing into her grandmother's embrace. The sobs that shook her body were not of sorrow, but of a dam of unspeakable trauma finally breaking. While Maya began the long journey of healing, the scales of karma continued their slow grinding work. Robert Davenport's trial was the spectacle everyone expected. He hired a team of celebrity lawyers who tried to paint him as a grieving father being framed by a corrupt system. But the evidence was insurmountable. The financial records, the bribery, the testimony of Kevin Fuller and Frank Miller, it all built an irrefutable case for motive. The final devastating blow came when the FBI forensics team presented the murder weapon found in a hidden compartment in Davenport's office safe, a 9-iron golf club. The faint blood spatter matched Ethan's DNA. A partial print on the shaft matched Robert's. He had bludgeoned his own son to death to protect his empire. The jury took less than 5 hours to convict him on all charges. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The very sentence he had bought for Maya. Arthur Sterling's fate was a quieter, more pathetic affair. Facing an ironclad case, he accepted a plea bargain to avoid a trial on the more severe conspiracy charges. His sentencing was a study in humiliation. He stood at the defendant's table in the same courthouse where he had once reigned supreme. He was a shell of his former self, his tailored suit replaced by ill-fitting county jail attire. When asked if he had a statement, he delivered a rambling, self-pitying speech about pressure and mistakes, never once mentioning Maya's name. The sentencing judge let him finish before delivering a scathing rebuke. "You speak of mistakes, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "You did not make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to sell your sacred oath. You chose to condemn an innocent child to protect your ambition. You were not a judge. You were a gatekeeper for a criminal. The damage you have done to the public's faith in this institution is incalculable." She sentenced him to the maximum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The final image of the once great judge was of him being led away in handcuffs, his face finally registering the cold, hard finality he had dealt out to so many others. In the aftermath, the state settled a civil suit with Maya for an amount that would ensure her and her grandmother's security for life. But money could not erase the scars. For months, Maya struggled, haunted by nightmares and a fear of open spaces. Her salvation, as it always had been, was her art. Tentatively at first she began to draw again. She filled books with her trauma-jagged lines representing the bars of her cell, the monstrous shadowy figure of Sterling on his bench, the hollow eyes of despair. But slowly new images began to emerge. The intricate lines of her grandmother's hands, the fierce, determined set of Ben Carter's jaw, the endless, beautiful expanse of a blue sky. A year after her release, a gallery owner who had been captivated by her story offered her a solo exhibition. Maya called it Courtroom 4B. The opening night was packed. On the walls hung her soul, a visual narrative of injustice, terror, and ultimately survival. People wept. They stood in stunned silence. They saw the truth. Standing in the corner watching people truly see her for the first time, Maya Washington felt a final chain break. They had tried to silence her, to erase her, to write her story for her. But with charcoal and paper, the quiet girl had taken her voice back, and it was more powerful than they could have ever imagined. The story of Maya Washington is a stark reminder that justice is not always a given. It is a fragile ideal that can be corrupted by power, greed, and prejudice. Judge Sterling and Robert Davenport believed they were above the law, that their influence could bend reality to their will. But they forgot one crucial truth: the system, no matter how broken, is still made of people. It took the courage of one juror, the dedication of one lawyer, and the quiet resilience of one young girl to expose the rot and bring the entire corrupt structure crashing down. If this story of karmic justice moved you, if you believe in the power of one voice to spark a revolution, then please help us share it. Hit that like button to show your support, share this video with your friends and family to spread the message, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We are committed to bringing you more stories of truth, consequence, and the enduring fight for what is right. Thank you for listening.